Thank you, Jim, for the nice introduction. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. It's a real pleasure to be back here as a UW grad. Though as I get to these other Big Ten schools, I always have to be careful. One of my brothers did graduate here, but as he put it, "Oh, you're on the East Bank last night at the hotel. He was on the West Bank for business." So there's always a way around it. As Jim mentioned, I have worked in different institutions. I've worked a lot in Latin America. Actually, my teaching role there, I do a lot in Spanish as well, hence one of the opportunities to come back to Penn State, which I wasn't aware of besides the epidemiology and the field crops role that I have, was our International Agriculture Development Graduate Program. This is a dual title program, so students come in to, say, plant pathology, entomology, and then they can simultaneously apply to INTAD, which is what we would call it as shorthand, and they get a dual degree. Their thesis really originates by having an international component as part of it. And so, for example, this spring I was teaching with a co-instructor, Melanie Miller-Foster, a seminar course, which is an embedded course. We were back in Costa Rica with my contacts for about 5 to 6 days. It's trying to build their networking, among other things. And they also work on, say, FAS or Foreign Ag Service style proposals as part of the course. So this is one of the pluses we have there. A lot of the students we get in the graduate program come specifically for INTAD, even though, ironically, they should be applying to the base department first and foremost. So what I'm going to talk about today is kind of a mixed set of work we do. Some of it is at a global level and working our way down to mostly soybean across the U.S., but it's this question about crop losses in global production and major field crops, sort of what are the impacts and perceptions for disease management. We're going to kind of look at it from a couple different perspectives. Some of this was recently published in Nature, Ecology, and Evolution. At the global scale, I'll describe to you how you can get research done on a very low budget. That was one great example that way to do it, but it was the buy-in from the community as a whole to provide this sort of information to allow us to move forward, among others. Just in case, I thought it was really important to show I might be giving the talk today, but this is a large collective effort in a lot of ways. My program at Penn State, much like Jim described, seeing the world a little bit, I have people based in different places. Dennis Shaw, who does a lot of the heavy lifting with me on some of our computational modeling, works out in New York State. I have a student right now from the University of Isosa working on us in wheat and fusarium head blight. I have a student based in Costa Rica actually working on black sigatoka and banana still. He's ironically from Kentucky originally, so you can get around in that way. I have some others joining the lab as well. Plus, on top of it, and I won't talk a whole lot about this, I direct and I administrate our large soybean on-farm network in Pennsylvania, which involves our extension team. We work in about 27 to 30 counties doing on-farm research of various types in that respect as well. Much of what I'm going to focus on in the early part involves these following authors: Serge Savary, Laetitia Villequet at INRA in Toulouse in France. They were at Erie for 2 rounds, as well as at Cartier in Costa Rica. Sarah Pethybridge at Cornell, Neil McRoberts, UC Davis, and Andy Nelson, who's a geographer who worked at Erie and is now at the University of Twente in the Netherlands, among several other colleagues that you'll see as we go through a lot of what we do. So it's a really large team effort to do a lot of this style research, especially when we look at some of the methods we try to apply to estimate crop losses in the absence of some of the empirical data we might like to have access to. So the general outline for the talk is some of the global trends for food and agriculture and how do they relate to what we need to understand in terms of crop losses and impact. I draw heavily on a recent FAO publication for much of this as we move forward. The first part of the actual research will focus heavily on the global crop losses, how we estimated it, how we got the buy-in from people to respond. I think they recognize the importance of this. The back-end challenge was how do you take that data and do something with it to some degree. I'll then scale this down. We've been working for several years. Actually, this goes back to about 2011, and several in this audience are well aware of this, providing data to the soybean disease losses. How do we look at some of the general trends? And what are we trying to do to extract more information out of that in terms of disease management for things like seed treatments and foliar fungicides, and then a little bit of conclusions and acknowledgements that way. And I use these throughout because they kind of illustrate some of the differences we're talking about when we're at these different scales. And the first part will be focused on these highlighted areas as food security hotspots, if you will, as we look at some of the estimates for the global crop losses. And then really what's important to understand here is the diversity we can see in terms of soybean production in the United States. If you look where I'm based right now, it may not look like a lot of soybean acreage, but every year there's a new record production. And a lot of that's driven by external factors, in this case, the poultry industry. In the East Coast, Purdue built a crush plant for soybean because the soybean, they're buying as much soybean as they can from this eastern seaboard to fulfill those niche markets, considering that for somebody from the Wausau, Wisconsin area and about 100,000 people living in another community of 100,000, I'm now 4 hours from hundreds of millions of people. So if you think of agriculture, it has a little different perspective in that way. So what are the things we might think about if we look at some of the long-term population growth trends? Where do they fit in what we do? I'm drawing from the FAO documentation. I have the full citation at the back end. You know, a lot of people will stand up here and say by 2015 we'll have 9 billion people, but that estimate's really one of the numbers that we can take on. If you look, while the projections are for increased population, the annual increments, which is this kind of pinkish line under the medium scale of growth and development, are trending downwards. And it's really variable by where we're talking about around the globe. If we overgeneralize this, we would assume that population is going downward, but it's really different in different parts of the world. Depending on the metric you use, the population estimates could range from actually a decrease by 2,100 on the low end of the spectrum to over 16 billion on the planet. And these are going to stress the system in very different ways. On top of it, if you look at where the population growth is really structured, even in Asia, there's a continuing increase estimated, which will then kind of reach a capacity or carrying capacity in some ways with a decline in birth rate. This may come down, but it's in places like Africa where that continuing increase is still on the rise. And most of the areas around us, Latin America, Caribbean, Europe, North America, or Oceania, are relatively flat, especially if we look here at 2015. We don't expect a whole lot of change. And in spite of the fact that some may argue our country is full, there's actually a lot of space, obviously, that we can still handle for a lot of this in that respect. So if you look at it in this way, there's a couple competing trends here that we have to emphasize. Where do we need to get these estimates from in very different ways? On top of it, and this is a big piece that I think we always have to consider, if you look at the trends right now or the projections going out, the big shift is out of the rural community into the urban structure. This is nothing new. Most of us are aware of this. Here we are at about 2015 to 2020. We can see that the relative percentage in an urban environment versus a rural environment, it continues that increase. The difference between the two continues to go up in that respect. I actually do some work with a colleague in rural sociology who's in Africa at the refugee camps. They have a very different set of issues they deal with because the rural community is sitting in a refugee camp and the food is coming from the United States on a bed. And so how do we change some of these structures? These increases are also, while at a global level here, as we can see by region, they continue to go up. It's not necessarily what the UN or FAO is defining as the high-income countries, where we're seeing that shift dramatically is in the low and middle-income countries. I was back in Costa Rica with the group and talking to a lot of the farmers on that trip. Their concern is access to land. The value of the land in an urban setting is much higher than they can afford, either as rental or buying outright. This is a very common problem that I think affects a lot of people. Even in Pennsylvania, our breadbasket is the southeast part of the state, high-yielding environments, 100 bushel soybean, 300 bushel corn. But you have very checkerboard fields because what is a large farm by definition takes you 2 to 3 hours to get across. to get to all the places. And that's sort of some of the competing interests, especially with some of the cost structure. One of the interesting pieces, and this again shouldn't be a surprise to an audience like this, if you look from 1950 to 2000, the global spread of crop pests and pathogens has continued to increase. The mobility and the movement obviously drives some of that. But if you add that on top of what are some general trends in terms of the annual average growth rate in yields from the Borlaug period, the Green Revolution period, very high growth rate, we see in general some declining trends on an annual basis with those sorts of growth rates. And so these are questions that we continue to ask in terms of how they may impact, or how these pests and pathogens can impact that growth rate over time, and something we're interested in looking at. So how can we do that? And one of the big questions, and this draws on experience from that work group I was describing, you often, every student, every researcher wants to put what the impact of the disease or the pest, the system they're working on in a proposal, or other things, and say it's 40% loss under the worst case scenarios, things like this. But how do you actually estimate it, and how reliable are those data? And most people cite back to the same literature, or this traces back several generations. If we look here, and this is work by my colleague Serge Savary, who summarized this, one of the biggest challenges, and I was having some conversations earlier today along these lines, is what are the methods? How do we do crop loss assessment? And if you think of what we term a preliminary portfolio, we have an idea there's a lot. There's two primary avenues we can take. One is the experimental layout, damage measure approach, which can be a model-based system, and there's different approaches to modeling, single injury, multiple injury. We won't go into too much detail there. The other way is a field survey methodology, and again, how we collect that data is going to vary a little bit by the question we're talking about. If anybody's ever done crop loss empirical sort of research, you know it's challenging to set up those trials to make sure you capture the widest range possible of the impact of the disease on crop yield, but that often provides avenues for simplifying this into a simulation model and going that way. We can get to some of the same places through the field survey methodology, but there's pros and cons to all of it. One is lack of standardization, can challenge us in a lot of ways. The other is sort of the reliability of the data and how you can capture it in a way that's useful in a quantitative or even qualitative methodology. But many of these, if you look through the literature in this area, while they talk a lot about what may be going on, there's actually a dearth. There's not a lot of recently published information. The closest we can come to is some of the work actually that Serge and his colleagues did in rice systems in South Asia to look at what is a production situation in terms of injury profiles. But beyond that, much of this, there hasn't been a lot of research recently, yet the questions still persist. This is really important because if you look at the decision-making process, we all know there's a series of tactical decisions management. It starts with genetics, resistance, things like that, but how does the fungicide, the crop rotation, different cultural practices fit in there. But over time, you're trying to package those into a strategy so you understand what the pest profile is to maximize and optimize the multi-component approach to these management decisions. And if, in an ideal sense of the word, you have decision rules. So oftentimes when we get questions, what's the threshold? Threshold doesn't exist for a lot of diseases. We don't collect that. We'd like to say that. We'd have all that information, but that's not the case. And so we try to package these around looking at the multi-component profiles and making best estimates accordingly. That's our ideal to try to do some of this. We can work with specific stakeholders to understand their mindset, but it still comes back to what does it mean for management. We had done this work focusing on corn growers and crop consultants because we had questions, do they provide the same sort of information? This was survey work we had done several years ago across a multi-state area. We had originally sent out the survey to 1,500 and got back about half of those. But what you can see here is their mindset for determining what's successful for corn production. It really sort of groups out into 4 key areas. And we have to understand those differences. First and foremost, it's about maximization, whether it's yield and or profit. It's one of those combinations depending on that. This is often going to be driven by commodity prices. We were focused on this sort of work at a period when corn prices had gone up dramatically. I even had a large grower in Wisconsin when I was still there at the time talk about corn as a specialty crop because all of a sudden their margins went up. And so their mindset was a little different to tackle some of these issues. Bring the corn price down, everything changes, same with a lot of these other major crops. Then we get into some of the factors that we might think of from disease resistance, crop rotation. Those are standard methods we have at our disposal. We talk about them in a lot of ways. Knowing your field history, tillage practices, even the cost of the seed, they're successful, but they're not necessarily the key driver. And interestingly enough, things like the new herbicides or combinations of fungicides and insecticides are actually on the low end of the spectrum. So they're recognizing that they should know under what environment they need to use some of these tools. Ironically, when I went to Costa Rica and now came back, I'm coming back to the exact same questions. And they're usually driven by these at the bottom of the scale rather than up the top. They're understanding that there's a lot of pressure to use these products, but they're not sure under what environments. And so that's what we're trying to understand a little bit at these different scales as we look through some of it. In terms of crop loss and the yield level, they're really quite similar, but one is focused actually on pesticide use as a way to look at these concepts of attainable yield. There's no theoretical yield or theoretical genetic yield in this example. Where do the losses fit? How do the losses get mitigated with the use of, or without the use of pesticide to get into these different scenarios? This is actually most of the data people cite for crop loss, going back to Oerke's work. This is how this was structured. It was based on the loss in the absence of using a pesticide product. When we talk about it, we also want to look at some other different things, and this was work we did several years ago to understand the same sort of paradigm, but maybe not in the use of the pesticide. What is actually required without tipping the balance of the system, putting more pesticide out there than would be needed? This is pretty theoretical for us still. We haven't been able to tackle this at an empirical level, but it has some similarities to what you might expect to see here in Oerke's work, that we're at an actual yield. We know we can drop down a little bit if we don't do certain things, but how far up can we actually tip this without putting too much chemical out there without any benefit, and maybe having a negative environmental impact? How do these estimates come about? So if you look here at the work that was done by Oerke, going back, and he summarizes these into different areas: weeds, animal pests, and diseases. You can actually see what they're trying to illustrate in some ways are the actual losses and what would be the potential based on different factors, including not having access to chemical control. This is where these losses really get into that play. What I want to emphasize here on the actual loss side, and we'll come back to this for wheat and maize with some of the updated work we've been doing. If you look for wheat over the generations from the 60s to the late 80s to early 2000, you see a slight increase from about 9% to 12 or 13%. In maize, it's holding at about 9 to 10 or 11% in that respect. But these are in very specified systems, usually in places where access to those chemical compounds are available. And that's a little different from some of the goals we're trying to look at a global scale. So the structure of doing this is a bit different, but this provides a baseline to move forward because our estimates should still provide a reliable estimate of what is known at that current level. So how do we do some of this? And straight away, I need to acknowledge for this sort of work, the International Society of Plant Pathology, because we have buy-in from that group, which was very important also for us to be able to have access to the expert list, to be able to conduct the survey. When we sat down, and so I've had questions recently about what have I done in an entrepreneurial sort of framework, and I said this is a good example. So this was a 3-day meeting in Raleigh, North Carolina. Minimal money to get everybody together. The person who invited us no longer works at NC State, ironically. He left for the private sector. On top of it, in the 3 days, we came up with the survey methodology and said we have no money to do this. So how do we do it? So we took the approach with Google Docs and the Google survey methodology. Our final cost for the research was 50 euros. That was to host the data until we could get the data out. You can do it some ways without a big grant, I guess. But we had to come up with a system, and we decided to focus on 5 major food crops: wheat, rice, maize, potato, and soybean. The numbers in parentheses are the human caloric intake percentage of each of those. So you're talking about approximately half of the global caloric intake from one of those sources. We structured the survey to be rapid. So that's this first, it was short term. We did not want it to extend out too long because we were trying to define time periods to do this. And we wanted to make sure we had the best response initially because we recognize that over time, response doesn't go up a whole lot. So that was one of our goals. We had to define the population, so in this case, it was the crop health experts. And that came from working with the International Society because we wanted to elicit accurate responses. We were going to run into some traps going forward with this sort of data. You have a lot of areas where you only have one expert for a country. So that's a slightly different challenge than what we're talking about here. We wanted to define specific crop pests and pathogens, so that's the survey methodology, but with the caveat that it's flexible. Because we're assuming we know what might be the problem in every area, which is not the case. So there's always that out, which is other, and then they're allowed to enter that sort of information. We did aim for georeference because it had to be spatially descriptive if we were going to scale it in any direction. So here we're talking about scaling it into hotspots. And we really wanted to emphasize that it wasn't just a group of 5 or 6 people. The value of the information coming back from an individual is very critical to this need. This allowed us, I think, to achieve what we weren't expecting in terms of response. We kept them in the loop the whole way accordingly. Now, I will be honest, when we got to publication phase, all of a sudden the IRB red flag came up. Because the lead authors, as we structured this, were in institutions that had no institutional review board, but were in the pipeline, and the question was, well, there's 3 co-authors from the US. Also, how do you run that through? I made references to my IRB who said, well, you have to come up with X, Y, or Z, or almost like a post effect, get approval for using the data that was already there. This just kind of slowed down the process, and thankfully we were able to work through it. But it is something for future reference you always have to take into consideration, even though we kept a very open and honest approach to the methodology. Here was an example form. This map will mean absolutely nothing. This is just a generic example we keep online for people if you go there. It's georeferenced by the person coming in. This is an example from we defined a base list, but then we also, here's that other piece, that we wanted the flexibility in there for the experts to identify things we might not see. 2 pieces that were very important to doing this sort of work is the loss magnitude. So here you can either provide classes of crop loss less than 1%, 0, 1 to 5, things like that, or a median value within the class. This was important because we had to then extrapolate in some ways or project out to what it means at a country level or otherwise, as well as the frequency based on a preset of classes or a fraction of seasons of occurrence. Because if you do it in an isolated snapshot, a single year, it's not representative. And for anybody doing this sort of thing, you want to take care of a problem in the field, you go work on it, then the weather changes and you don't have the disease. And we knew those sorts of things. We needed that variation also to understand it in that respect. So what can we see? In just that 3 months of time, we had almost 1,000 responses from it. Very simple tool, probably 5-10 minutes to enter the data, so it wasn't meant to be exhausting for anybody in that respect. It came from 219 experts around the globe, 67 countries, providing information about 137 pests and pathogens. After the fact, we sat down and said, okay, what are these hotspots? What do they mean in terms of sort of production and management going forward? We defined specific regions and even sub-regions within countries. We have the US Midwest because of the crop profile there in the relation to Canada. So mostly driven by our corn soybean production system. We have a parallel sort of system in the South Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay, and Argentina because again, that aligns to sort of the same structure. Northwest Europe, West Asia, and North Africa set up here. Sub-Saharan Africa, we have the Indo-Gangetic Plain coming through as a different system. China and Southeast Asia. Ironically, you can see we have gaps in the data. It's not a perfect data set by any means. We really tried to emphasize, we even reached out specifically to colleagues in Eastern Europe and Russia, among other places, to try to generate that information. After the fact, I had a query from Colombia. Was there data coming in there? There were about 4 responses. We know there were responses from other countries, but not enough to generate the same sort of structure. What can we see globally? And I present the data as a point estimate, sort of an average across the globe, and also giving you the ranges here. You can see, depending on the crop, from potato through, say, to rice, we're ranging from about 17% loss to 30% loss. But that in and of itself doesn't tell the whole story, which we'll get into in a second. What you see is the range here. It's quite variable, 20% range in maize, 13% give or take in potato, about 15% in rice, 20, and almost 20 in wheat as well. And so we know there's spatial variation across the whole. And that's very important because one of the challenges here when you collect this sort of data is, can we actually validate it with something known in these areas? We could be wildly overestimating the actual loss or grossly underestimating if we don't have some validation sort of data coming through. I have a series here. They're all kind of laid out in the same way because this gets at the hotspot differences. So what you'll see here is on the upper bar, production per person in kilograms as a frame of reference, and the yield loss estimates as a percentage. Here's the global data. These points here, these squares, represent the global data as a frame of reference by different areas. So like in Northwest Europe, you can see the production is variable. You don't have all the crops producing the same, say, as you might in China here. But you also don't have the same loss profiles across a lot of the crops. So in wheat, yes, there are issues in terms of crop loss, but it's also overcome by a higher production than, say, in some of the other areas versus global scale. Whereas, say, in potato, losses are typically lower than expected. And this is a very common trend depending on where you are in the world. Chinese production in China here, you can see the differences outside of soybean, the production per person. And their main issues, at least from the responses we had available, were for wheat and rice. And they're close, maybe slightly above the global average. So this is giving us a frame of reference of some of that spatial variation. If we look here in the US, obviously for main crops like wheat, maize, or corn in this case, and soybean, we typically have an overproduction per person in terms of kilograms in that respect. And our loss profiles vary a little bit by the crop type. Wheat, maize, potato losses are considered lower. Soybean is a bit higher, but I also think soybean, one of the things with this sort of data, soybeans had a longer history of having people collect loss data around the country, which may influence that. West Asia, North Africa, you can see production shifts accordingly. And minimal losses, we are talking about an arid environment, which makes some sense in that respect. Where if we look to India and some of those areas, obviously the production can meet some of the production needs per person, but the loss profiles, especially in rice and maize, are quite high compared to the global average. So this is getting at some of the hotspot differences accordingly. And as we move through, I'll emphasize here, if you will, if we look at sub-Saharan Africa as an example, production needs aren't getting up to that global average, and the loss profile, the double penalty, is really starting to be seen as much in things like wheat, rice, and maize accordingly in some things. We did have a dearth in some of these areas. Like I said, you may have one expert providing the feedback. And so the biggest challenge to estimating these was really to try to find an accurate production level estimate at the country level. Production statistics accordingly to be able to scale that information up in that respect. The main pests, and we can debate these, everybody probably here might have a favorite pest or pathogen that's a little different. I'm focusing here on the top issues. All of these heat maps kind of illustrate the same sort of thing. So the sort of response frequency and the yield loss estimate across the whole, these are the worst case scenarios working our way down. You see where the gaps are probably a bit more localized in different areas. But ironic, what we see a lot of questions about on the maize side are the Fusarium gibberella, the stalk rot complex, as well as the ear rots coming out. Fall armyworm, especially coming out of some of the places in the more tropical environments. Interesting northern corn leaf blight is a major issue that comes up in a lot of areas, as well as other stalk rots and then the southern rots. But you can see even within that profile, while maybe on average they're above 1% around the globe, there is spatial variation within those hotspots. It's not identical in every area. And that was one of the goals, is to try to understand that difference. In potato, a bit different profile, but if you look again here, you have late blight, obviously leading the charge a little bit in terms of across these different hotspot areas, brown rot, early blight, and nematode issues in some of the areas, although not everywhere. And then again, it spatially varies a bit by these sorts of hotspots. Rice, sheath blight is far and away if you look. And again, these are changing by the areas where we know these losses are occurring, so they're not in every hotspot. And what we're presenting here, stem borer issues, rice blast obviously coming up as another issue, brown spot, bacterial blight, leaf otter in the brown plant hopper. But even there, you get down to some of these, and you can see there is some spatial variation, even though on the whole they are about 1% on average in terms of the losses. Soybean, cyst nematode, and that's driven heavily by issues we see here in the US at the level, weightingness. White mold, another major issue. Soybean rust, even with the gap, again, this is driven by different areas where they're dealing with it. The Cercospora leaf blight, brown spot, charcoal rot, root knot nematodes. We'll focus a little bit more on this sort of data at a US scale. Some of these things fit in very well that we would term our more national level. They're everywhere versus even geographically different between maybe northern and southern US. But again, we can see from the experts, there is a series in all of these classes of diseases that come up. For the wheat, in this respect, you can see wheat issues. Our hotspot detection was much wider than some of the other crops across most of these hotspots. So you have a combination of leaf rust, the FHB or scab, triticide blotch, stripe rust, spot blotch, tan spot, the aphids, and powdery mildew also. But as we get into this group from spot blotch on down, we can see again, that's more spatially aggregated to specific hotspots. There's a series of issues that we see being much more pronounced across multiple hotspots versus some of these other ones. And then there's a lot of other things that pop up periodically. On top of it, what we really attempted to do here was try to understand this, and I know there's a lot to read here. The first graph is broken up into three to try to pull apart the information you can see here in terms of the associations. But there's really a kind of a very low to low, moderate, high combination that type out not just to location, a physical location where you are in the globe, but also the crop type where it's dominated in terms of the production, and interestingly enough, what we see in terms of these emerging pests and pathogens, which we'll get to in a second. So if we sort of pull that out, The losses would be termed low or very low in the maize soybean systems because we're talking about major production areas, North America, South America in that respect, where the management and control is a bit better. Then we move into area of rice and wheat. Rice is an interesting one because in the major production areas, you can see real subtle differences looking back at the literature in terms of their different systems from labor to water use and the impact on the pest profile. And then we can often see potato associated with a high loss magnitude, which shouldn't be all that surprising given some of the issues for things like late blight in that system. There's a tight correlation in a lot of ways with some of these systems to what we see in terms of the loss magnitude by hotspot. It varies a little bit as we kind of arc through. So the United States, that Midwest and Canada system would be termed low in comparison to these other hotspots. As we move through Southeast Asia, China, into the Indo-Gangetic plain. And then we see the effects in West Africa, North Africa, or Sub-Saharan Africa being high relative to the loss profile. And so these are areas we do know they deal with issues, their management portfolio is not quite as strong accordingly. If we continue along here, the key point in this bottom graph is understanding what we can see in terms of the emerging pests and pathogens associated with these loss magnitudes. You have things like fall armyworm, which is in the news. You have soybean rust, striga, maize lethal necrosis, the rust complex, stem and stripe rust, wheat blast, brown rust. Those are correlating out quite strongly or associating out very well with these high loss magnitudes. So in spite of them not necessarily being seen in every hotspot at a great level globally, we know these are on the increase in things that match up very well to what we would expect or are concerned about accordingly. Moving along, how do we take that down a scale? So that's a global sort of perspective. I'll close the last part of the talk a little bit on some of the things we're doing here at the US level, which is trying to then pull apart this sort of thing. Just as a quick reminder, these are the main diseases. Most of these would show up in the loss profile for the US accordingly. What we're trying to do here is extend what has been published in various different ways. They have different titles for a lot of the same terminology, the effects or suppression or loss. They're usually published in 3 or 4 year cycles, freely available information. But the general question from, say, the soybean farmer or the commodity group is, what does this all mean for us? What does this mean in terms of other factors? So what we had to try to do here, and we use this data to validate back the other way to the global loss. Do those estimates make sense here? We had to try to integrate a lot of information because we received the raw data in the form of bushels and nothing more, nothing less at an annual level. That's how we start for this period we're working in. So we would work backwards with USDA data to figure out the actual loss profile by these pest or pathogen or nematode combination. But then how do you actually estimate total loss? And the subscripts aren't showing up very well here in the translation. But the idea is we're not doing anything novel. This is nice work that's 60 years old, give or take, to do a combined loss profile because you know not all diseases occur together at the same time. On top of it, then we're looking at different combinations of the dollar loss by combinations of years, states, and or disease and nematodes to allow us to look at some different questions and how management may or may not have changed. If you're interested, you can find all of the raw data in some ways. They're available through these 2 websites to look at some of that. One is because Carl Bradley was hosting it at Illinois, he subsequently moved to Kentucky, and it's being published through the Crop Protection Network currently. One of the things you can see, the red line here represents soybean rust discovery kind of period in soybean. If you look pre-2005, loss profiles were fairly consistent, kind of bouncing around. But since about that period, we could see a dramatic increase peaking in 2012. This does coincide with the increase in soybean production price received. And since then, a reduction, but we also know there's some other factors involved. I marked a few of the states here, Minnesota just to give you a frame of reference, Iowa also because of the production scale. I'm in Pennsylvania, technically the loss profile is quite high. I will agree, the disease data last year was the most disease I saw working in this part of the US. I didn't have that much in Wisconsin, to be honest. We're in a very nice environment, humidity, temperature, all these factors, on top of last year having about 70 inches of rain. So it made for a fun summer, if you will. So losses are very important. I highlight North Dakota because it's interesting with soybean cyst nematode discussion. A lot of it's being driven by what they're finding there more recently in that respect. This just illustrates what we do. If you close your eyes, you'll make up different numbers on this chart accordingly. But we do try to bring this back to the skates level in terms of what the dollar value amount is. But I really want to emphasize, even though Iowa as a large production state, if you look over the years, their trend is actually downward. So we can ask questions about management. Minnesota has seen a slight increase over the years, but it's relatively stable, and the peak periods, thankfully, don't just coincide necessarily with high production prices. Because that's what you always worry about with data like this, that it's driven by that and not the actual disease level. North Dakota, even though it was very low early on, this is what we're seeing in the shift, especially with the discovery of soybean cyst nematode, some of these hidden robbers. In Pennsylvania, we kind of bounce around. These are more comparison. But it allows us some flexibility to look at some of these differences across the whole. We illustrate this in different ways. So I heard a lot of students talking about sun-death syndrome in their project. You can see here, we keep these scales for losses in dollars very consistent. You can see the effect in Michigan and Minnesota. It's lighter, but it's constant in that respect. You can see also in Wisconsin as an example. In others, it's less clear and it bounces around. You see some hotspots periodically in some of the other states. The soybean cyst nematode, what's interesting is you can actually, if you stare at this long enough, or maybe have one too many drinks, you can see the pattern even easier. Sorry to say it that way. But you can see the south to north movement, and you can even see how management comes into play to bring this down. Genetic resistance, say in Iowa. But what's very interesting is if you look here, it's subtle. There's a darkening in North Dakota. And on top of it, we also know some of the things with PI 88788 are driving the discussion. So we still see these pattern of movements across these different areas as dictated by the loss profile. What does it mean in terms of different factors? Obviously, the north produces a much greater quantity, so it drives much of the overall loss versus southern US, but we look at different things here across the two regions. The discovery of soybean rust did change, I think, how people are scouting in the field and looking at it. The pre-post sort of loss profiles are very different. I emphasize here in harvest zone or production zone, these are qualitative sort of metrics based on USDA data. Just producing a lot does not mean you have more loss. There are differences geospatially. Much of the harvest and production zone are in the northern part accordingly. So we know these differences do drive a lot of what we see, and that's driven by the last part of the talk, which is about what do we do about it. And so seedling and foliar diseases, these are really at risk and need. I hear the word cheap insurance, other things that way. You can see seedling diseases are kind of constant in much of the upper part here in soybean, whereas something like a septoria brown spot, it really does vary geospatially where you are. And even last year for us with high humidity, it wasn't our main, we saw a lot of frog-eyed leaf spot, one of the cercosporas because of the weather, more than we would have seen with a brown spot. So what we can do there and what we've been working on is there was a pesticide national synthesis project. And so this data was from 2005 to 2015 or 14, depending on the type of information available, to try to relate the actual use of these compounds as they related to the losses. Do they make sense? And so we focus on the two areas, different active ingredients grouped together. And a lot of this coincides with also the discovery of soybean rust in the system. So So we're trying to see if the experts are providing information that matches some of the data on pesticide use. One of the big trends we see, seed treatment fungicide use has gone up about almost 1,000-fold increase as total use, as well as grams per hectare as active ingredient. That's been a long-term trend that we can continue to see its application. Foliar fungicide had a peak period here around 2007 as an active ingredient combination, slight continue increase over the same period, but not to the same degree as the seed treatments. What we try to do here is how does this actually relate to the loss profile? And so I grouped these out, region north, region south. The seed treatment use related to overall production, we see a positive trend in terms of the 1,000 metric ton of production. But does that actually, how does that actually translate in terms of a physical quantity of yield? And our ultimate goal is, what does it mean economically? Does it tell us something? While there's positive trends in both situations, the predictive value varies. So just telling me what a person is using in terms of a product which relates to the active ingredient combination probably isn't going to tell me a whole lot about their yield. I don't think this is a surprise. If you look at these regression lines, you're talking around the order of 32, 33 kilograms increase with every increase in the actual use of active ingredient. This is along the lines of what we see in empirical studies in a lot of ways. Very low, non-economically viable data in that respect. On the foliar side, it's even messier, if you will. If you look at the total use and at the value in terms of production, you're talking on the order here of some increase, but not a whole lot. At a field level, there's really no relationship, and it's very low if you figure out the cost structure to some of these products. And so we continue, even this sort of data, which is at a very different scale than what we might do at a field level, matches quite closely to some of the empirical data. There are increases, but they're probably not economically important. Assuming here that the expert responses to some of these things are matching to what the situation is in the field. We also do this in a slightly different way. This is a work in progress because this came from some of my agronomy colleagues. They were doing large-scale surveys across the region. One of their preliminary pieces is that they saw a response to foliar fungicide across these farmer response profiles. So they came to us with a question, can you help us uncover the patterns in that? And I'll tell you that's not a complete story. I don't have the answer today. It's a work in progress, but it's my world. This is my big data, I guess. If we're comparing apples and oranges, we're talking about 5,300 field responses across the whole in 11 states over 3 years. For a slew of different measurements, it's probably on the order of 500,000 to 1 million data points in total that we're mining through. The thing about it is that they had a very simple question. Is there a response to foliar fungicide? So we go back to what we know about the pathogen profile, and I just said, can we explain it epidemiologically? So we wrote out questions, so not to bias ourselves. Dennis Shaw was working on this with me. He gets a little overexcited. That turned into almost 400 pages of work. But the idea is any answer we see, if we do machine learning algorithms or other modeling approaches, should come back to a very simple answer. And actually, in one of our working papers, we can say it's figure 48 or whatever it may be. There is some logic to this approach. One of the first things that was interesting to report, depending on the state, the use of foliar fungicides, as indicated by the farmers, does vary from here in Minnesota, testament probably some of the efforts of Dean and Jim, 11%, what are the needs and use, up to almost half from the responses. This is what caught our eye. On the whole, here's Minnesota. So you can see applied to none. I think this is the only example that shows there was no effect by the farmer across those 11 states. So there's a lot of questions we have to ask. Kansas provided us a very distinct profile in some of those ways. This gets nothing at the economics right now, but it's a question we're trying to do accordingly. And we can see across these maturity group zones, which do correlate to some of the different states, we see differences also. So we're looking at these patterns in many different ways, because one of the things is we recognize from a management perspective, these soybean producers are not necessarily just going to apply fungicide alone. So you have to pull apart the fungicide-insecticide combination to see where those profiles come out. And I will just, as you can see here in Minnesota, almost nobody applies just fungicide, at least based on the information provided. And there doesn't seem to be much to note there versus some of the other states. So we're trying to understand this in a way that's not overgeneralizing a response. I think there's other factors, other patterns behind that sort of work. When we do some machine learning algorithms here, what you do notice is the explanatory value of the fungicide is actually rather low, just in a very preliminary sense of the word, versus some of the other factors we see in that situation. So our actual movement is a little different in our modeling framework from this point forward. We're taking an approach called causal modeling. So we're working from the idea there was a response. And so we're going to build the model in a logical fashion working backwards. Because otherwise it's very correlative and it leaves a lot of room for doubt. So what factors would drive it? If you've ever looked at this literature, they usually start with an idea. There's an execution and neither of the shooters will pull the trigger unless they're given the order. The order only is given if there was an actual trial where the verdict was execution, and so we play these games working backwards to try to model it. We can do some of the same sort of things here with what is probably a logical set of parameters they put together, but this is the next step accordingly. So to close, I just, a lot of different examples of what we kind of do, understanding these profiles and what do they mean from a management perspective. So we know these pests and pathogens are continuing to have some negative impact. And while it's really important to understand them, there are some caveats to do research or policy prioritization. We know it's not uniform across these scales, nor is it necessarily uniform within a specific scale. So we first at global, national, regional, etc. Even where I work in Pennsylvania, we have many microclimates because of the terrain variation. And I always get a comment like, you need to come to my valley. My valley is different from what's on the other side of the mountain. And in some ways, there may be some truth to that, but we're looking for the general tenets. The specific management tactics or strategies don't always correlate with actual loss or need for such tools. This just verifies what a lot of the empirical research also shows us. And trying to get at this requires us looking and using different approaches. So it's not a one-size-fits-all methodology here, but it's usually driven by the question rather than the methodology. So the method should help us uncover some of that. So if you're interested, these are some of the references I was citing throughout. Feel free to contact me accordingly. And just to close that way again, we had a lot of support from various institutions, both commodity group, USDA-wise, all of the institutions we work at who provided special things, especially for the original work by the ISPT. Because without their support behind it, it would have been impossible to start that global one. So with that, I will close, and if there's time for a few questions, I'd be glad to take them. Thank you. Yes, sir.
I have a question about the survey you discussed using like the Google Forms. You said that was almost 1,000 responses, and that was, I guess I'm curious how that was distributed, how it was sent out, just some of the logistics.
Yes, that's a great question. So with this, we defined our population based on what the International Society of Plant Pathology could provide for a master list, and then we verified that to other known experts that we felt would be within that same sort of population rate. So it was sent out in that respect with multiple sort of email reminders. We did it early on. That we had no incentive behind it. We couldn't offer an incentive in some ways, except goodwill and things like that. So we just tried to remind them. And then as results kind of started to come in, we would do some initial exploratory looks, if you will, at where they were coming in from, and could we already identify gaps that we didn't have in that original population. So the Eastern European Russian example was originated from that sort of, wait a minute, we know there's heavy production of these sort of crops in that area. Do we know anybody? So it's kind of a hybrid in the end, but we started with a population defined by the ISBP. And we just tried, truthfully, to emphasize, the value here is it's a comprehensive approach based on your expert knowledge. I couldn't put any money in an envelope for anybody. Didn't really have any money either, but it's neither here nor there.
How much do you know about the methodology of Oerke, which you referenced from 2006, and do potential differences in that methodology with what you use explain some of the...
Yeah, they looked at, so their methodology would match a little bit like the pesticide synthesis project, looking at some of the patterns of use and estimation. But ironically, a lot of our estimates, if you pull apart where the data from Oerke was coming from, they do correlate quite well. So what it tells us is probably either methodology is pretty stable. We're not getting disparate answers, even with the time period. So there's this focus on pesticide use, non-use to estimate the loss. Ours is sort of based on what the expert knowledge in the field. Very good question.
In terms of long-term impact, you had sort of kind of what you might think of as like ranking lists for pathogens based on crops and looking at those 5 staple crops. I'm curious about how long-term ranking fits into that. If that was based on 1 year, I can't remember now.
So the loss frequency, we gave various options where they could provide. So it could be sort of the 1 in 5 year or annual occurrence. So we would assume if it's annual occurrence, based on the expert providing it, that we would expect to see some loss to some degree every year versus 1 in 5. Now I couldn't tell you which year that would correspond to. I don't have that temporal grading piece, if you will. But we did give them a loss frequency, a set of answers, or they could modify that to provide that feedback. So that's the flexibility, because they might say, well, it's actually
This year was an exceptional year for whatever.
So if we would have ran it, let's say last year, for some of the areas of the upper Midwest or the East Coast where you have these record rainfalls, we probably saw unusual occurrences of some of the diseases that we might expect more annually or near annually, but just the magnitude of that would have just blown it out of the water in comparison to what you see in general terms. We've already talked how we can do it because we also know there's survey fatigue. So you don't just bounce back in and you don't keep running the same sort of survey like this constantly, because you'll never capture the sort of valid results. You'll always just kind of be nibbling at it. And we have to sit down and figure out what is that frequency, because we don't want to get into a cycle. Here again, it's 20 years or 30 years, same sort of question. I don't really want somebody citing 2019 data working on a system in 2045. At that level, it's probably not reflective.
How long do you think this will be good?
Well, probably,
what kind of lifespan windows?
no, I think this has,
5, 10?
probably in the 5-10 years, because we asked questions that allowed us to work backwards at about that time scale. So we figure it has a forward look. And it allows us to adapt a little bit. So like last year is a very good example for some of the systems we would have dealt with. They correlate very strongly to the top diseases we saw, like in maize and soybean in this part of the world. But I wouldn't expect that to hold through a couple cycles.
Oh, I just had a quick question. You were talking about foliar fungicides, and the thing we've seen is it's kind of rampant application of seed treatments where we're up to 5 or 8 or however many seed treatments. All the companies do it. Does anybody look at the merit of that practice? It's being forced on the growers.
Yeah.
At costs.
I mean, it's being forced on them, or it's being recommended under what we might term as cost-effective or cheap insurance. I can use a Pennsylvania example. So last year I had a lot of requests for talks about nematodes. Soybean cyst nematode in particular is what they're marketing these products on. Soybean cyst nematode in Pennsylvania has been found in 2 fields and 1 county. So my simple logic is, well, if you don't know, do you really need to do that? And that's where they're feeling the pressure. So they're looking for that sort of data. A lot of these, if you look at even the empirical or this sort of scale version, trying to extrapolate a bit, if I extract out the economic part, are we seeing much difference with or without what we might expect? It's not there. It's not there. And I think there's several papers in review trying to look at this in some different systems, including seed treatment insecticides and neonicotinoids, for example. You just don't see it across a large geography, if you will, any difference. And so what's the environmental impact piece? We've got to figure out that way of wording it. But it's hard in a lot of these. You're seeing very little, at best, if I use bushels per acre, maybe a half bushel, or a foliar fungicide, 2 bushels, things like that. As I said last year, working in Pennsylvania in a very, very favorable environment. It was the first time working in the Midwest, in my case, or the Midwest Eastern part of the U.S., I could see real differences. But I also had people say my house smelled like mold. And coming from living in Costa Rica for a while, I said, oh, okay. But that's how humid we were. We were 100% humid for a very favorable period. So the disease was driving, the interaction was there. At least in my situation, the interaction was there, so some of the things we could deal with. But in a general scheme, I have a hard time seeing.
Yeah, we saw that on a field by field basis and just like
A lot of variability. Wheat, I think, using the coordinated project mindset with like fusarium headlight, there's scab, that allows us that variation, but then we're looking at the big picture also, the benefit. And but that's very coordinated, very structured to tackle what you would see at a field